How my players broke my campaign in the best way. Part 1 of 2. IDM, a homebrew super large campaign set in a land called Vaya Prashaya, made up of 33 states. The players were still early in the campaign and within the first state, Eastren. The group was a tiefling wizard, Arcus, a tabaxi cleric, Rain under Sharp Plains, nicknamed Rain, and a mousefolk druid, Hemway. They were backed up by 2 tabaxi rogues, Whicker and Stump. For some needed background, I followed proper naming conventions for the tabaxi, that they are named after a metaphorical or literal description of their home, or station upon their birth. Whicker's full name was Wicker Basket by the Door. You can guess his backstory. He was the romantic companion of Stump, a strong, hulking tabaxi who was named Stump by his old mistress, the powerful Scarlet Lady. One of the 3 most powerful people in the land. With the Year of the Queen, the Scarlet Lady ran most of the legitimate and criminal organizations in the entire kingdom, wielding huge political and social power. She would, in fact, be the primary villain of Chapter 2 of the epic story. The players were currently on Chapter 1. Stump had been raised in her care as a slave where he did everything for her, but he was also abused by her in the worst ways you can think of. She called him Stump as an insult, to say that he was too stupid for anything else. He'd escaped years ago, an escape that had led to one of his other friends, a fellow slave, to die. A death he blamed both her and himself for. Whicker had been the only one that had brought joy back to his life. The group were in a forest that no one enters. Those who enter do not get out. It was known as the Kenswood. They discovered that the reason no one escaped was because it was protected by a hidden village full of centaurs, who killed anyone that trespassed in the forest. However, due to a medallion they had from a previous centaur they dated in the previous town, they were proven to be friends and allowed to pass through their small town in the middle of the forest, the town of Burkton. Whilst in the village, they found children had been going missing, and through some clever sleuthing, found a serial killer centaur among the herd in the form of the tavern owner. He'd been stealing children, defiling them, and murdering them. He claimed to be doing this to protect the herd, so they would never overpopulate, and wouldn't grow beyond the boundaries of the forest that kept them safe from those that would do them harm. The other centaurs were horrified at this. He was subsequently executed by the townspeople. Unable to handle what had happened, both Stump and Whicker offered to stay within the town, take up the running of the now ownerless tavern, and put down better roots for the future of their life. After a tearful goodbye, my players wished them the best and moved on. The players were avoiding the main road, known as the Purple Road. It was a royal route that threaded its way through all the states of Viprasia and led to the capital. Paladins, the continent's main source of power and guts, used this route as their patrol and travel route often, and thus, they had smartly chosen to avoid the road. Sadly, they couldn't. They needed to cross the road this time on their route. After leaving the forest, they crossed a field and hid behind a small rise in the ground as they spied the road, making sure the coast was clear. But it wasn't. The dice favored a perception check, and they spied an approaching convoy. The convoy was made up of 6 paladins on horseback and a 7th on foot at the rear, all escorting a carriage with a crimson insignia on it. One that none of them recognized as they were still new to the area. They recognized the paladin at the back without a horse, Bal. He had helped them in the beginning and had originally been assigned to escort them over the Purple Road after they'd been arrested for xenophobic reasons when they first arrived in the land. Their escape, they'd known, would get him in trouble, but they valued their own safety more and thus had escaped him. He was in manacles when they saw him then, at the rear of the escort. The mousefolk was the only one from the country, and thus was not wanted by the guard. He padded over and made small talk with the paladins, with the aim of finding out if Bal was going to be alright. They didn't like the guy due to him being a paladin, but they didn't want him to come to harm. Through conversation, they found that he was on his way to being punished when they reached their destination with this highly important individual in the carriage. The intention by me, the DM, was for them to let the carriage pass by, to discover Bal later on, and for this to raise questions. They were, after all, only 3 level 2 characters. And these 6 paladins were all level 5s. They didn't stand a chance. But my players were not to be hindered in their quest for justice. Arcus, the tiefling, formulated a plan. First, the tabaxi cleric, Rain, ran back to the forest and through it, following the safe paths all the way back into the centaur town of Burkton. There, he called in the favor they'd garnered from helping their village with a serial killer. The entire town agreed to come to their aid. He led them into the Kenswood, through the safe mushroom paths to the area they had chosen. Second, and after waiting 1 minute for the tabaxi to be well on his way, the druid mousefolk, Hemway, changed into a horse, ran up to the paladins, turned and kicked the side of the carriage hard. Some rolls happened to determine some outcomes. And it worked. The paladins gave chase, leaving their carriage and chasing the horse hard. The mousefolk druid, in horse form, rolls a crit and manages to outrun the guards, and he rushes into the forest. A roll keeps the guards on their tail. This was not simply allowed. They got lucky. Between a check for the guards' intelligence, to the mousefolk's attempt to get them to follow him, to whether or not he was fast enough to outrun them, to whether or not they were smart enough not to follow him into the supposedly dangerous forest. Somehow they rolled 18s, 19s, and several crit 20s on the die. Thirdly, the tiefling stands up and approaches. Bal runs forward, shocked and confused at the events. With a little magic and heat, the locks on the manacles were broken, and Bal was freed. "You shouldn't have done this," Bal warned, looking bewildered. "Who's in the carriage?" Arcus asked curiously as he approached it. Bal replied, "Someone important." Arcus nodded and used magic to freeze the door closed. Fourthly, the paladins rushed through into the trees after the runaway horse, and into the arrows of 30 centaurs. They were blessed by the cleric and their arrows flew true. They hit, and critted, and tore, and punctured armor easily. They fell, one by one, by a sheer stroke of luck from the dice. The final one left alive on low HP was the leader himself, injured, on one knee, staring up at the centaurs and the small unassuming tabaxi cleric approaching him. "You'll never get away with this, you filthy tabaxi," the paladin yelled violently. "I just did," Rain replied with a ricious grin. The cleric struck him down with divine wrath. The paladins they had not even supposed to face had been defeated without a single loss of life. The group went back and looked upon the frozen carriage. "Bal," said Rain, nodding to the paladin who nodded respectfully back. Rain wasn't a fan of paladins. A scar across his face that marred his complexion was a gift from one in his past, and thus, he had trust issues. But he looked to Bal now with more respect, more kindness. The tabaxi approached the paladin, and reached up, touching his fingers along his own scarred face. He looked at Bal and gave him a wary glance over. "Paladins have never been a friend to me." The look on Bal's face showed he understood what was being said. "You helped us when we first got here, and we repay that by running. For that I'm sorry, especially as us doing that seems to have caused you harm." Bal reached up and ran his hand over his braided head. "You were only trying to survive. I can understand that." He gave the small cleric a warm smile, and offered his hand. Rain under sharp planes took it, and shook that hand readily. "You should go, and please, don't come back. I imagine if they were upset at you before, now they'll be pissed." The tabaxi gave the paladin a wry grin. Bal looked a little nervously from them to the carriage with the frozen door, and the muffled yelling from its interior, "What are you going to do?" At those curious words, the group went to the carriage, unfroze the door, and opened it. There, staring them in the face, was the Scarlet Lady. Third most powerful person in the entire realm, huge political and social influencer, vastly important to the politics of the entire nation, and now at their mercy. They considered what to do with her, knowing that if they let her go, there was nowhere her influence could not get them. The cleric turned his eyes back to the paladin. "You should go," he said again with warning in his voice. Bal gulped, nodded, turned and ran. The group looked back to the old woman. What would they do? They'd been asked. They had little choice. But it would seem that her fate, they decided, was not theirs to decide. It did not belong to them. So they locked her in the carriage and took it with them as they once again ventured back into the forest to the centaur town of Burkton. They rolled the carriage up to the tavern. They called out Wicker and his companion, and when they were ready, they opened the carriage. "I'll have your heads," she screamed, but she was only a woman. An old woman, staring at them with rage-filled eyes as she was surrounded by a tiefling, a tabaxi, a mousefolk, and an entire town of centaurs glaring down at her. She turned towards the tavern, and her eyes locked onto those of one she knew. Stump. He saw her, and the expression on his face was not one that could easily be described. "You!" she screamed, glaring at him. "Me," he replied. His voice was as still as water, with no emotion, no coldness, simply there. As though he felt he were dreaming. Wicker turned to his love, a paw on the larger tabaxi's chest, and said softly, "You don't have to do this. We can go back inside, and go, right now." Stump could only stare. In her eyes, he saw his life. The death, the whippings, the beatings, the rapes. And the last thing he saw were different eyes other than hers, those of his friend who had ran beside him, eyes he'd seen lose their life as a hail of arrows had skewered his form. This was for him. Stump approached the old woman. "What are you doing?" she demanded in a confused voice, as though she couldn't believe this had even happened, as though the very thought of it wasn't comprehensible. She backed off, fell over, scrambled away from him. He walked calmly, approaching her step by step, until he lowered his hands to her, wrapped them around her neck, and broke it. The team left after that, Wicker and Stump still staying behind, and they left with heavier hearts than they'd arrived. I look back at that moment a lot. My players had broken my second chapter. The political ramifications of her death and disappearance would be huge consequences. The entire second chapter would be altered by the political upheaval. And the direction of the campaign had been forever changed by their decision. Their decision to not let a friend meet his fate. But it wasn't just one friend. Bal was not the only one they'd saved that day. For they'd given closure and peace to a tabaxi, and freed him from his past. Stump would live well and in happiness. It was the best thing my players could have ever done, and I'd never even considered it an option. Yes, the second part will be out tomorrow, so hit the subscribe button if you enjoyed it, and before I go please check the link in the description for our Discord channel. There's loads of D&D chat and crazy memes.